Nowadays, keys in Dead by Daylight are a relatively niche item. On paper, their functions actually seem quite useful, however, being able to see your teammates is nothing unheard of, and the ability to open the hatch in the current version of DBD is laughably bad. What if I told you, however, that in the earlier years of the game's existence, the hatch functioned much differently and its mechanics allowed for some of the craziest plays imaginable. From hatch standoffs to the whole team escaping right in front of the killer's face, in this video we'll be going over the history of keys and the hatch in Dead by Daylight. The hatch was planned to be in the game ever since its early prototypes back in 2015. It originally had a progression bar and required a key in order to be opened, much like how it does today. The developers kept refining this idea, and when Dead by Daylight released on the 14th of June 2016, the hatch was already in the game. At first it was referred to as black locks, as we can see from the skeleton key's description. Speaking of the skeleton key, this was the only available key in the game during that time, up until patch 1.1.2 when both the dull and broken key were added. Now let's get back to the hatch. Unlike today when the hatch spawns only when there is one survivor remaining, back in 1.0.0 its functions were much different. Back then the hatch became visible to all players after the following condition was met. The number of completed generators had to be at least one more than the total count of remaining survivors. For example, if 3 survivors were alive, 4 generators had to be completed. If there were 2 survivors, 3 gens had to be completed, etc. Now, notice how I didn't say that the hatch spawned if these requirements were met, instead I said that the hatch became visible. Well, the hatch would actually spawn right at the start of the match, it would just be invisible and unable to be interacted with until that certain condition was achieved. As soon as the number of repair generators became at least one more than the total count of the remaining survivors, the hatch would become visible in its closed state. From here, the survivors could either choose to complete the remaining generator/generators, or alternatively unlock the trapdoor with a dull or skeleton key. This would open the hatch for 30 seconds, after which it would close automatically. During this period, every survivor was free to escape out of the hatch. Mind you, the mechanic for closing the hatch wasn't even in the game yet. Could you imagine a situation where you're playing killer, there is one generator left and you've finally gotten your first kill? You think to yourself, alright, maybe I have enough time to down the 3 remaining survivors. But what happens instead is that one of the survivors finds the hatch, opens it with a key for which there wasn't even an animation back then, and all of the other survivors also happen to stumble upon the trapdoor and escape without even having finished their objectives. This was so incredibly unfair and led to killers hard-tunneling survivors from the start of the match just because they saw them holding a key in the pre-game lobby. You might even start to wonder how and why the developers didn't think this through when they were designing the game. Well, funnily enough, there was another situation that devs thought through even less. Take a look at this clip. As I mentioned earlier, killers weren't able to close the hatch, which meant that if there was only one survivor remaining and the killer was the first to find the trapdoor, they would have no other choice but to stand there and wait for the survivor to come. But why won't the Jake just escape through the hatch? Well, killers couldn't close it, however, they were able to perform a grab action while the survivor was in the escape animation. This led to a sort of paradoxical situation where whoever made the first move instantly lost. If the survivor jumped through the hatch, the killer would grab them. If the survivor got hit, they would be able to escape since the killer would be in the cooldown animation. This was called a hatch standoff and occurred when both players were too stubborn to let the other side win. In fact, some players were so stubborn that there exist videos online of hatch standoffs lasting up to 45 minutes. The only redeeming factor about this was that if you were the last remaining survivor, the hatch would spawn open much like today, but only if 2 generators were already completed. For example, if your teammates died at 4 gens, you still had to repair one more generator in order to have the chance to escape through the hatch. This was actually the reason why the original Left Behind gave you bonus repair speed instead of revealing the hatch's aura, so that if you were to find yourself in this unfortunate situation, you would have a slightly easier time with the gens. Anyways, I got a little sidetracked there, let's get back into the video. All this stuff with the hatch and keys was arguably some of the worst designed content that has ever existed in Dead by Daylight. Keys were so incredibly unfair for killers since they were the freest get out of jail free card, required no skill and had absolutely zero counterplay from the killer side, and hatch standoffs were probably the most ridiculous mechanic in Dead by Daylight's history. Things had to change, so during the 2.0.0 PTB, 2 entire years after the release of the game, the developers made a proposed change to the hatch mechanic. During the public test build for Dead by Daylight's second anniversary chapter, the developers tested 2 iterations for the hatch closing mechanic. The first version of this mechanic worked the following way. The killer could go up to an open hatch and perform a close hatch action. The remaining survivor would then have to repair another generator in order for the hatch to automatically reopen. In the second iteration, closing the hatch powered all remaining generators, requiring the last survivor to open an exit gate instead. The first version was discarded rather swiftly, as neither the developers nor part of the community were satisfied with how the changes played out in the PTB. It also opened up other problems which led to the devs deciding to revisit the entire endgame situation instead of just the hatch alone. Ultimately, the second iteration was chosen as the one to be implemented alongside other endgame changes with patch 2.7.0. The 2.7.0 update implemented the new Endgame Collapse mechanic, and with that also came the long-awaited changes to the hatch. The hatch would now always spawn and open when there is one survivor remaining in the trial, regardless of how many gens were repaired, although the previous requirement of the number of completed generators being at least one more than the total count of remaining survivors would still apply if there were 2, 3 or 4 alive survivors. Furthermore, killers could now close an open hatch, which after that would require a key for it to be reopened by a survivor, and which would initiate the Endgame Collapse timer, instantly completing all remaining generators and powering the exit gates. Additionally, killers could no longer perform a hatch grab, which basically fixed the whole issue with the hatch standoffs. However, many of the previous problems I mentioned were left completely untouched. Because the hatch was still able to spawn when there were, for example, 2 alive survivors with 2 remaining generators, this meant that players could still use keys, more specifically dull and skeleton keys, to completely avoid repairing the remaining generators and escape basically for free without actually deserving it. Killer mains were becoming really impatient and frustrated with behavior seemingly naive incompetence. It was clear that a big rework was needed, but before that would happen, the developers implemented several band-aid fixes to try and calm the situation down. The first one was made during patch 4.7.0, where the time that the hatch stayed open after unlocking it with a key was reduced from 30 to 10 seconds, which of course fixed practically nothing, as the main problem was the fact that such a thing was possible, and a simple number reduction wasn't enough to solve the issue. The next change was introduced during the 5.1.0 update, where it was made so that dull and skeleton keys were now required to have charges left in order to be able to open the hatch, since before that survivors could use up all of the key's aura reading energy and still be able to unlock the trapdoor. I should also mention that the 4.2.0 update added the Vigos and annotated blueprints, which marked the first time that the hatch's spawn location could be influenced by players. One more thing to note is that the hatch received a visual rework as part of the Realm Beyond update during patch 4.4.0. Now let's move on to the big rework. On the 19th of October 2021, with the release of chapter 21.5 The Hour of the Witch, Behavior also implemented the long-awaited balance changes to the hatch mechanic. This update made it so that the hatch would only spawn when exactly one survivor was left alive. Additionally, survivors could now open the hatch after it had been kicked shut by using a key, and a new 2.5 second long animation for the interaction was added. This was finally it. Gone were the days of killers losing unfairly to a single key item. Fun fact, when you actually think about it, keys have pretty much stayed the same since their release and almost never been nerfed directly. It is just that all of the changes to the hatch have made them pretty much redundant. Except of course if you're using the Blood Amber add-on, which in all honesty really is quite strong. Ever since the 5.3.0 update, keys in the hatch have received no further changes and have stayed exactly the same. Well, that was it. We went through the entire history of keys in the hatch in Dead by Daylight. Thank you guys so much for all of the recent support, especially on my latest video. I don't know what to say, this feels absolutely unreal. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!